Any one of these 12 elements can sabotage your novel. But don't feel bad, they're actually pretty common mistakes that a lot of writers make. And plus, as we're going through these, I'll give you advice on how to fix them so it's not all doom and gloom. 1. Chekhov's Armory. You've probably heard of Chekhov's gun, right? Which is where a gun on the mantelpiece must be shot by the end scene. Basically, it's talking about how when you show things in a book or in a movie, you have to have them come back into the plot because the readers expect that. Chekhov's Armory is when you show a whole bunch of guns on the mantelpiece. You show a whole bunch of stuff that's gonna set the reader up for later on in the book. And then you don't do anything about it. The narrative ends up being disappointed because the reader hoped you were gonna do something with all these great material, and yet you leave all the guns unfired. A primo example of this is the television show Lost. I honestly think the early seasons of the show are some of the best storytelling that we have ever seen on the screen. We have all these mysteries going up. How did they not die in the plane crash? What are the others? Who is the smoke monster? Why is this island so mysterious? Why do they have to press that button in the bunker every 108 minutes? So people are on the edges of their seats waiting for the show to fulfill all those early promises. I mean, I even remember going to a Lost party at one of my friend's house. That's what a big cultural phenomenon it was. The trouble though is that all of these fantastic storylines, they didn't get resolved in a very satisfying way. I mean, you could tell the writers were like trying to do something to resolve each of these storylines, but the truth is they had started too many, and then when it came to the end, they just didn't have the narrative resolve to be able to wrap things up. So I'd say the end of that series was one of the worst endings that I've ever seen, and you should never do that to your readers. 2. The everything but the kitchen sink syndrome. This is when you have so many great ideas for your book and you try to cram them all in. Look, I know you have a great imagination, that's why you became a writer, right? The trouble is you also need a disciplined imagination to know what fits inside the novel and what you're gonna have to leave for the next novel. Instead of having 5 themes, perhaps you need 2 or 1. Instead of having 15 characters, perhaps you need more like 7, with only 3 or 4 of them being really major characters. Instead of having 4 subplots, maybe you only need 1 or 2 subplots. Now later on in this video, I'm gonna give plenty of examples from books, but for now, let's look at a movie, Jupiter Ascending. Jupiter Ascending got 28% on Rotten Tomatoes. I mean, you've got to work to get as low as 28%. And I think its main problem was that it tried to cram so many different things into the movie. You have space opera, you have romance, you have political intrigue, and in the end, the viewer just feels very bewildered. Now, it's not as though any one of those things was bad, right? They were actually all great story elements, but the trouble is when you try to put them all together and make them all work in a single narrative, the narrative collapses under its own weight. Now, if you've written a novel that seems kind of kitchen sinky, I will say that's perfectly okay, right? A lot of rough drafts end up being kitchen sinky, and it takes a good revision process where you whittle away the things that don't belong, where you simplify. That's what gets your book to the publishable level. Number 3, Worldbuilding Vertigo. This is where you create such an intricate fictional world of magic and social cultures and world building and languages that the reader tends to get lost. I mean, this is always the trouble in world building, right? You have to give all of this information so that the reader feels like they're stepping into this cool new universe, but at the same time, you can't overwhelm them or else they're gonna be like, where's the actual storyline? So a couple of examples on this. Some of you might have read Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash. And to be honest, overall, I think it's a fantastic book, right? It's a seminal book. Its imagination is just off the hook. But there's one part of that novel where he just starts going on and on and on and on about Sumerian languages. And when I got to that part of the book, I'm like, I think this needed a little heavy-handed editor. Just trim a bit of this back. I think he got so caught up in the world building that he forgot to keep the pacing rapid. There's a section of Moby Dick where Melville just drones on a bit long about the size of whale brains and phrenology, which is where you can like interpret personality based on the shape of a skull. Diving a little too deep, Melville. Haha, pun intended. No, but seriously, I think he fell in love a little bit too much with the research and forgot about the storyline. That said, I actually love Moby Dick. Or another example, Dune. I think everyone would agree that the first book of Dune is just an absolute masterpiece. It's perfect. But I think as you get later on into the series, book 3, book 4, book 5, it gets bogged down in an enormous amount of like political and religious backstory. The political and religious systems are so complex that I've had a lot of people tell me like, oh, I hated the rest of the series, just read the first book. Your goal with world building is to give the reader enough information that they can follow and track with the adventures of your protagonist, and also enough enough that they feel like they are immersed in a world that feels completely foreign than their own. But on the other hand, not so much that you get caught up in these minor issues of world building that don't really satisfy your reader. 4. Inspiration indigestion. These are books that are wearing their influence so much on their sleeve that you feel like they're kind of ripping off the other book. What I see most frequently as editor are Harry Potter lookalikes, and I've read a good number of these novels, both published and unpublished, and they're always leaning a little bit too heavily on the sort of Harry Potter framework of the school and magic and an orphan who's suddenly special. It's just a little bit too close for readers to feel like, oh, this author has done something fresh and new. I mean, it's good to be inspired, right? You actually want to be inspired by an enormous range of books, and you should read really widely so you can get all that inspiration. I think the trouble comes when you don't properly digest it. You read one book and suddenly that book inspires your book so much that it seems like a copycat. Another example of this is probably the most derivative book I've ever read in the literary world. It was called Red Sky in Morning by Paul Lynch. And when I read it, I thought, this is a Cormac McCarthy ripoff, specifically a Blood Meridian ripoff. It's based on a historical event. All the characters are male. The language that he uses was identical to Cormac McCarthy's. The villain was identical to the judge in Blood Meridian, down to the very speeches he gave. And the stories both end in a tragic way down to the main character. And what's sad is that if I hadn't read Blood Meridian, this actually would have been a great book. I really enjoyed it. But the trouble is, because I had read Blood Meridian, this felt like a ripoff. And I'm like, bro, you're really talented, but you have to write your own book. 5. The aesthetic over ethics trap. This is when you craft reprehensible characters or situations purely for shock value rather than having it contribute to the story as a whole. And I understand why it's easy to do this. Writing shocking things gets a reaction from your readers. It works. The trouble comes when you're not really trying to say something through that violence or sexuality, if there's not a point to it, because then it just starts to seem gratuitous. You're just putting it in there to manipulate the reader rather than it serving the interests of the story. I have a movie and a book example for this one, and let's start with the movie Saw. And I'm talking about, you know, the whole film franchise of Saw, all the sequels and everything. I think it's a series which focuses so much on the elaborate torture scenes as a way of like getting a reaction from the viewer, rather than saying something meaningful about life or violence or existence or something. And I'm not saying that people don't enjoy that. I'm telling you that if you're crafting that kind of story, you need to have some sort of reason or justification or lesson or insight or something from the character that gives it a little bit more depth. The second example, which I think does a much better job of this, is A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. Now, I'm not talking about the American version, which is 20 chapters long, and I'm not talking about the movie version. I'm talking about the 21 chapter British version. So this is a book which contains tons of ultraviolence. I mean, horrific things happening to very innocent people. But I think at the very end, Burgess really rescues it because he has Alex get captured. So there's some sort of punishment for his violence. And in the end, he grows up and he turns away from that life of ultraviolence. He carries a picture of a child symbolizing that he wants to get married and have like a respectable life. In the end, there's a very strong message that there is a possibility of people who have chosen ultraviolence to turn away from that violence and be integrated into society. Now, I'm not saying the ending of your book has to be a happy ending or show the character changing in an unbelievable way, but I'm saying you should have some sort of point if you're going to show crazy amounts of violence. 6. Dialogue ventriloquism. This is where every single character in a book basically sounds like the same person. So it's the author being a ventriloquist and throwing their voice onto every single character. Ideally, you want the author to be able to channel original voices for every single character, right? I think a good example of this would be Aaron Sorkin's The West Wing. Everyone has these rat-a-tat clever one-liners, and if you really listen to everyone's dialogue, it all sounds like Aaron Sorkin. This is the guy who wrote The Social Network as well, and I think you can see those dialogue tendencies in that film as well. I'd say the Twilight series by Stephanie Meyer is another example of this, where if you just take out all the dialogue and put it all in a separate sheet, it all kind of sounds alike. But I feel like of all the mistakes on this page, this honestly might be one of the easiest ones to solve. I mean, why not just give one character a lisp, or make one have a regional accent? Give one person a drawl, make one character curse a lot, give one character a catchphrase, make one character speak very formally, like the butler in The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. Look, if this is something that you struggle with, I'd actually recommend that you take my dialogue course in the Bookfox Academy. I give a lot of exercises and lessons in how to make sure your character sounds only like your character. In other words, they sound differently than all the other characters. Check that out. I'll put a link in the description that you can follow. 7. Metaphor overdose. Okay, I should say right off the bat that I don't hate metaphors and similes, right? I think they're beautiful, wonderful things, and you should definitely include them in your writing. On Bookfox, I actually have a list of the 100 best metaphors ever written, and you should give that a read. It honestly is very inspiring for your own writing. But I will say that I've read some published books and also some unpublished books where the author's gotten a little too metaphor/simile crazy. There are so many flowery comparisons, I start to lose sight of the story and the characters, and I just think, oh wow, this is quite elaborate. Once I read this short story in a literary magazine. I cannot remember the name of the author of the short story, but there were probably 400 metaphors and similes in 4,000 words. I mean, it was every single sentence. And so this was the author's shtick, this is what he did. It was his style. I looked up some of his other stories and he always did this. But you know what I got from that story? I got from this story is this author thinks he's smart and he wants me as a reader to think he's smart too. I don't think that should be the takeaway of your story or your book. Really, what you want to channel all the attention to is your storyline, is the character struggles, is to the emotion that you want your reader to feel. So look, cut down those metaphors and similes. Go through your book and only use the ones that are absolutely necessary, that really compare two unlike things and that actually contribute to the reader's understanding of the story. Number 8, lack of character motivation. Why is the most important question you can ask of a character. Why are they doing this and not that? Why are they taking any action in your story? It's fine if your character doesn't know their motivations, right? As long as the reader can either guess at what their motivations might be, or if you're keeping it a secret and later on you're going to reveal their true motivations. I think a great example of this failing is the movie called The Room. If you don't know about this movie, it's famous for being the best, worst movie of all time. I mean, it's atrocious, but it's hilarious because it's just so bad. It was made into a movie called The Disaster Artist with Dave Franco, but I encourage you to go back and watch the original. It is wild. Anyway, there is a scene where they're throwing a football around inside, like 5 feet away from each other, and randomly, a character named Mark pushes a character named Mike. Why? I don't know. There is so much in that movie where you're looking for motivation and you're like, I do not know why that character just did that. And by watching it, you realize how essential and important character motivations are. I also think it's really interesting when motivations are particularly petty or funny. There was an episode of Supernatural where an angel went back in time and stopped the Titanic from sinking. Now, what was the motivation of that? Oh, you're thinking this angel wanted to save lives and prevent a tragedy. No, it was because this angel really, really hated My Heart Will Go On by Celine Dion. And so they wanted this song never to exist. And so they saved the Titanic from sinking. That is some kind of motivation right there, but it still worked, right? I mean, it's a crazy motivation, but it's still a motivation. 9, temporally shortsighted. This is a story that's so fixated on its present moment that the characters don't seem to have a life before the storyline or any sort of future after the storyline. If we know nothing about your character's past, that is not going to feel like a real person. It's going to feel like a cipher, a made up character. Now, it is fine that if it's a mystery, you're keeping it for later on in the book, as long as at some point the reader gets a sense this person lived a life before this point. And I'll also say you don't have to explicitly go into backstory and reveal huge swaths of this person's life. If you just give a sense that, oh, this person had a life before, if you just allude to it, it doesn't have to be heavy-handed or take up a lot of space in the book. A good exercise is to sketch out a timeline of your character's life, just so you know what has happened over the course of their life, so you don't make silly errors like getting a former job wrong or something like that. In Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, she actually does a great job of focusing on the present moment story with the father, but also talking about his struggles with an absent father and worrying about the future for his daughters. You can also do the opposite of this mistake, where you focus so much on backstory that it overwhelms and overshadows the present moment story. So you have to ask yourself what mistake you're making. Are you focusing so much on the present that you're forgetting the past? Are you focusing so much on the past that you don't have enough dramatic moments in the present? Number 10 is the gotcha spiral. This is a story that relies so much upon plot twists that it starts to feel a little bit contrived and the reader starts to feel a little manipulated. It's an impulse toward have constant surprises, but if those surprises aren't earned, then it's gonna feel false. I'm not gonna mention the books that I'm thinking of because, hey, who knows, maybe you read these books and you enjoyed these books. But I will talk about some of the common problems that you get when you rely too heavily on surprises. One, sometimes the reader feels manipulated. They know what you're doing, they can see what you're doing, and it's a surprise not because it's intrinsic to the story, but because they know that you're trying to get a rise out of them. Ideally, you want the author to be behind the curtain so that the reader doesn't think, oh, the author's trying to do this to me now. And if the reader can sense the author hiding behind the curtain and pulling all the levers, then the surprise isn't quite as fulfilling. A second reason a lot of surprises can fail is that the reader sees them coming. This is part of the problem with M. Night Shyamalan movies, is he made so many movies that have this huge twist in them, after The Sixth Sense, obviously, that viewers started to expect those twists and they started to see them coming more easily because they know oh, this is the guy that does lots of twists. In the end, I think that made his movies a little bit too predictable. A third reason that too many surprises might not work is that you didn't earn all of the surprises. By earn, I mean there needs to be little clues beforehand where a reader can look back and see, oh, okay, it all makes sense. As opposed to having zero clues and then just upending their expectations for the story, they're gonna feel a little abused and a little taken advantage of. So in general, it's better to just have one or two twists rather than a whole series of twists in a row, but make sure that the twists that you have, that you really earn them by laying clues throughout the whole story. Fourth reason why a bunch of surprises might not work is that I do think it reduces the ability to reread with pleasure. If the majority of the pleasure that you give in your book is simply the reversal where the reader is surprised, then they're not going to be able to reread that and feel the same pleasure as they did the first time. Number 11, checklist character development. This is when characters feel like they've been built by just going down a checklist, sort of characters 101. What should my character have? Oh, they need to have a certain color hair, a certain color eye, we need to know what clothes they're wearing, they need to have a hobby, and they need to have one other thing. Characters built in this way, they feel like they've been built by an algorithm or by AI, rather than having the sort of contradictory vitality of being an actual human being. Here's some examples of a checklist character. Orphan, but truly special and talented. Inside a romance, if you have a man who's in finance, trust fund, 6'5", blue eyes, come on, that's a checklist character. To avoid a checklist character, work on giving your character surprising character traits. Sometimes these are contradictory traits, like a rich man who doesn't spend any money. Sometimes these are character traits which are out of character for them. For instance, imagine a really cool, hip, smooth woman who plays the accordion. I always loved this character building in Parks and Rec, where it was revealed one season that Ron Swanson snuck out to a jazz club where he plays jazz saxophone under the name Duke Silver. Somehow that reveal was both deeply surprising and also true to his character. And the 12th and final mistake is subtext is everything syndrome. This is when you make your story so subtle and elusive that it's kind of impenetrable to the reader. Basically, you're mistaking being obscure for being profound. Now, don't get me wrong, subtext is great, right? Subtext is an essential technique to make your story better, so that the story doesn't just exist on the surface, but there's layers that you can peel back to better understand that story. And if this is something you really want to get better at, I would recommend that you read The Art of Subtext by Charles Baxter. It is thick, it is dense, but it's also just packed with great nuggets that will help you introduce more subtext into your writing. But the purpose of this point is to talk about writers who end up going too far with subtext. And I see this quite often in my work as an editor, where a writer has alluded to something or hinted at something, and I, as a reader, am thinking, I don't get what you're going for. I don't understand where you wanted me to go with this story or what you wanted me to think. And so I have to gently tell them, okay, I think you were trying to make me feel this, but I think you need to make it a little more explicit, make it a little less subtexty. Ultimately, the danger with too much subtext is that the reader's gonna feel confused. So there's this fine line you have to walk where you don't want to be so blatant and explicitly say your themes or the subtext, obviously. But at the same point, if you're too elusive, then no one's gonna get it. I do think that commercial writers need to work on putting more subtext into their fiction, while literary writers need to make sure that the subtext that they have is still understandable.